This is a really special program tonight, and I want to welcome all of you and our special guests, curator Rebecca Dobkins from Halliford Museum of Art, and Crow Shadow founder and artist James Lavadour. And tonight's panel discussion will be moderated by Associate Professor of Fine Arts Michael Halloran, and I would like to have you help me welcome Michael to the stage.
As one of the great experiences I had previously here in this museum before it was opened, we had guests from the Nez Perce tribe here to kind of bless this facility as it is located on the homelands of the Nez Perce and Palouse peoples. A little context, not too long. I was given 5 minutes, and I figure I'll probably only take 15. So knowing that some of my students are here, they'll recognize that. But last month I had the opportunity to visit the Crow Shadow Institute of Arts outside of Pendleton on the Umatilla Indian Reservation, which are the homelands of the Umatilla, the Walla Walla, and the Cayuse, and our guest James Lavadour is Walla Walla. It's located near the foothills of the Blue Mountains. To most, this would be the last major obstacle for travelers who pass along the Oregon Trail before making their way to the Columbia River Gorge. To the St. Mary's Mission where Crow Shadow is located, I drove past the cemetery and up past the mission, and was kind of reminded of my own home. I'm from the Colville Indian Reservation up north outside of Womack on the Colville Indian Reservation, and we have our mission there, St. Mary's Mission. And to me, there was a lot of similarities, but I was looking, I was thinking about the place, and it brought to mind that their mission, St. Andrew's Mission on the Umatilla Reservation, in 1997 had celebrated their 150th birthday. And on that day, from Baker, Bishop Thomas Connolly, who's now retired, a friend that I'm proud to say, and other priests asked for forgiveness for the pain that many students suffered at the mission's former boarding school. This same building now inhabits Crow Shadow, which at that time was only 5 years old. When speaking with my students in my survey course on Native American art history, I'm forever addressing the history of U.S. federal Indian policy while talking about American Indian art since early contact. Looking back to the distant past seems to be much easier for most of my students than what has taken place for tribal communities in recent times. The American Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 is a great example. Here, federally recognized tribes were able to exercise self-governance and decision-making that directly impacted their own peoples. And when I was looking at Crow Shadow, I was thinking about that era and the transformations that took place, and the building itself to me represented such remarkable evidence of that. So with that in mind, I was thinking how similarly Native American artists pursued their own artistic sovereignty, breaking away from expected norms of non-Native audiences while engaging a contemporary world that saw tribal communities demanding authority over their own lands, culture, and future. Crow Shadow Institute of the Arts is a phenomenal example of the commitment and ongoing success to these hard-fought rights. And so with that, I'd like to welcome my guests today, James Lavadour and Rebecca Dobkins, if they join me up here. And I had the privilege to talk with James and Rebecca prior, and was able to receive some conversation, some ideas about Crow Shadow and about the work that surrounds us in this gallery today. With that, I thought not only what I might ask questions that of course will elicit conversation, but if there is any specific image that our guests want to point to or speak to, of course that would always be beneficial. But for James, I wanted to ask, he was talking about at this time early on as tribal artists from the Umatilla Reservation that had gone down to the Southwest to the Institute of American Indian Arts and pursued their degree, which they achieved, and would come home, then there might not be any opportunities in the community for them. And so this kind of recognition really promoted this idea with James and others that started to think about a commitment to provide some community access to arts. And I asked James if maybe you would expand on that.
Yeah, well, I came back home to the reservation. I grew up on the reservation until I was about 8 years old, and I came back when I was, about 21, and about 1975. My dates and figures and all that kind of, jumbled up. At that time, the modern tribe was just beginning. There were no tribal programs, were just little programs in trailer houses and such. And there was a core group of people who were trying to make a change. People coming back from Vietnam, and the first people who graduated from universities and colleges. And so there was this energy happening on the reservation that was infectious. The whole idea that, that's before sovereignty and having, control of the land and all that. But that was the big struggle. That was the big, I won't say fight, but it was a fight in a lot of ways. And art making was sort of like, I don't know, there were so many artists on the reservation, Ellen Taylor, and John Beavis, and Philip Cash, Maynard Lavadour, and just on and on. There are many, many artists that had gone away and come back, and there was nothing. And I had, about 1980, I had started showing for Sacred Circle Gallery in Seattle. That was my big break for me. And I got to meet all these artists, Joe Feddersen, and Edgar Heba Birds, and Hemi Whitehorse, and Kay Walking Stick, and just the whole generation of artists that were my age. And they were, this whole thing was just starting. There had been sort of a new wave of Native American artists that got big in Europe, but there wasn't really much going on in the United States, mostly in anthropology museums, natural history museums. That's where Indian artists were showing in group exhibitions, and the Herd Museum, and a few others. But on the reservation, there was nothing. No, there were art, there's like the Oregon Arts Commission and different things. I had been showing at Sacred Circle, and then I kind of graduated to another gallery, Elizabeth Leach in Portland, and started being able to make a living at it. And I realized, all these artists out here, and so started getting this idea about Crow Shadow, and that's really the time period it started. And it was just a pipe dream, I talked about it to people, what if, and talked about it for several years. It wasn't until about 1990 it became incorporated, and then the tribe helped us achieve our first funding, Tribal Community and Economic Development Office.
Thank you very much. When I was talking with Rebecca in Portland last month, one of the comments we made was, it's always interesting when you're involved in the process, you're not thinking of a lot of the things that are happening. After 25 years, to be able to look back and then contextualize and see maybe in a way what was happening at that time, what was taking place, it might be a little easier. But as James mentioned, at those early moments, you're just trying to get things done and not thinking about the larger context of how it connects with everything else. So for Rebecca, I'd ask if she might reflect on the unique social and artistic context of Crow Shadow in the early years.
Thank you. And thanks to the staff here and to the Schnitzer Museum and to Jordan Schnitzer for making this place possible. I was here a couple years ago for the Bartow show, and it's really fabulous to see the transformation, so you're very fortunate. The 70s in particular, with the Indian Self-Determination Act, and with the infusion of programs like VISTA, I think you were a VISTA worker at some point, but this is all pre-gaming, right? Pre-Indian gaming, for the most part, there isn't a national act until 1988. And at least in Oregon, tribes and Washington, tribes don't really begin to make any significant profit from gaming until the early 2000s. But I think some of the bigger context that maybe Michael is alluding to is that what was happening at Crochetto and Jim's focus on the arts as an expression, but also arts as a livelihood, and then the eventual arrival at printmaking as a medium, as one of the many media that Crochetto focused on, does have precedent in other indigenous communities, not just in North America, but around the world. So this idea that one of the ways that indigenous people, so the Inuit in the northeastern part of Canada, what's now Nunavut, and Nunavik in northern Quebec. Many Aboriginal Australians developed painting, but also printmaking, especially in northern Australia, as a way to stay home, be home, and make art that was a part of a media, a process that was both, certainly I think on the surface, considered from a Western tradition of printmaking, although also really want to emphasize that the Inuit were largely inspired by Japanese printmaking, but it was also profoundly sculptural. And so that, in a sense, is really keeping with many indigenous art traditions. So I think of Crochetto, even though I don't think, Jim, you were looking to those other examples particularly, but I see this as not coincidental, that in various places in the world, printmaking was seen as a mechanism for indigenous art and expression, and to one degree or the other for being able to make a livelihood.
I'd like to add that, I got my main inspiration from Rutgers University. I got a fellowship. I didn't know anything about printmaking, and I went there and worked with master printer Eileen Fody. Then I realized that, printmaking is almost evangelical. There's Eileen especially has been out in the world, Botswana, South Africa, all through Eastern Europe, and setting up print shops. And so, and also the Rutgers program was one of the focal points was bringing in artists from all over the world to work there at the center. So, it really fit in with my kind of what to do in the world. After I'd worked for the Tribe for 15 years, I worked in alcohol and drug and education and natural resources, and I wanted to do something more than that, because I had no expertise in all those areas. I'm an artist, so.
The first description was creative actors of survivance, and the next was a narrative of emergence. And so I wonder if maybe you might expand on both of those for our guests.
Well, I'm really glad you asked me about those phrases, in part because I am the co-author of the essay, of one of the essays in the catalog. I'm the curator of the show, but we felt at Crochetto, and I'm pointing to the executive director, Carl Davis, but many of us felt that it was really important to have an Indigenous curator, art historian, to be part of this project. So we approached a good friend of mine, Heather Atone, who has written about several of the artists' work and has also been really interested in printmaking, and herself had just curated an exhibition that included work from Crochetto at the University of Oklahoma, where she was then a curator. So Heather and I collaborated on the essay, which was a wonderful experience. And those phrases, creative survivance is one that is taken from Gerald Bisner, who some of you may know his work, a provocative and fascinating fellow novelist, used to teach at UC Berkeley. In fact, I was his TA when I was in graduate school. But Gerald talked about survivance. He was one of the first Native scholars and writers to talk about not just survival, as in, whew, oh my gosh, we're still here, but in thriving, so survivance. And I think that what Heather and I both wanted to talk about and to emphasize in printmaking and in Crochetto was how Crochetto is a vehicle, a vessel for that kind of process. That is an ongoing process that will go on indefinitely. So there is an emergence, there is a process of artistic emergence, and that won't end.
Thank you very much. James talked about this kind of digging down into the medium to learn and understand. That's how it was with weavers and the things that came to them in that process. And I was so fascinated about that description of bringing these Crow Shadows building, not just with the art, with the printmakers, but to bring artists from the community who work on traditional arts, and the weaving kind of process being one of them, and the things that would come out in that process of learning, of finding things that come back. And I wanted to maybe share, because we have a lot of art students here, and maybe you could talk about that as maybe an opportunity to talk about your own creative process, James.
Well, one of the things we found when we started Crow Shadow was there was a great need for just organization. There, the Plateau people are very creative. I call it indigenous creativity, which is different than just art. It's something that is in every level of life, every talking and organization and making things and hunting and there's a different way of looking at the world, and it's not called art. It's called something well done or something. It's not necessarily art. It's not an art from. One of the things Crow Shadow started was economic development. That was one of our taglines. Social and economic development, and weaving was always a part of that. People wove and they traded those things, and there was some world-class great weavers that have come from this country here. I mean, just amazing. You go to the museums, and all of those things are gone from the reservation. All that great work, but the people are still there. And so we thought we would encourage weaving and have workshops, and we didn't realize that there was this great vacuum, that one generation really from the people who used to weave for keeps, as opposed to a newer generation of people that wove for art. As we started workshops, all the participants pushed all the tables all together, so they could all be together at one table.
No, I think that for me, when we spoke, I remember you mentioning so much of what you do comes from the process. You don't have an idea that you just go execute.
Yeah.
That as you're working in your own work, or that these ideas, of course, come to you in the same way that you were talking about, how the weaving, almost this kind of cultural kind of memory comes back, other things.
I think of art making really as a way of acquiring knowledge of the world, rather than expressing something, it's discovering something. And that kind of, there's no blueprint for that, there's no, you're going where no one's gone before every time you pick up a pencil and make a mark. And that is Crow Shadow in a nutshell. It sort of shaped itself in a lot of ways.
I was just, I was going to ask Jim, if you would just say a couple more words about how printmaking itself impacted your painting practice.
Well, I'm a self-taught painter, and I just painted. I started when I was a child, and it carried on through my entire life. That became my life. But I really didn't understand what it was I was doing. Since I was self-taught, I didn't have history, art books or schools, or, I just looked at the pictures, and I borrowed things or ideas and things. And I really didn't understand a lot of what it was, how I went from A to Z. I just went there and kind of floundered and struggled and slugged it out until I got to a finished work. When I started printmaking, it was excruciating for me. because it's a process, you know, and there's layers to it, and each layer adds up to the next, to the next, to the next. And it was, I mean, mind-bending in a lot of ways, you know. But once I learned how to do it, it became really liberating in my own process. I began to understand, and I was able to analyze and deconstruct the way it is I work, and understand the process of how to arrive. And all of a sudden, instead of doing one painting at a time, I was doing dozens of paintings.